This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon and welcome to AI Answers, weekly updates from the world's leading valuation authority. My name is Bill Garber, Director of Government and External Relations for the Appraisal Institute. It is November 11th, 2020, and we're going to talk about the 2020 elections and the impact on the real estate valuation profession. I'm joined by my colleagues in the Appraisal Institute's Washington office, Brian Rodgers, Manager of Federal Affairs, and Scott DiBiasio, Manager of State and Industry Affairs, who are going to help walk us through the 2020 election results and talk a little bit about early insights on impacts on real estate appraisers. We're going to start with federal affairs issues and Brian Rodgers. Brian, welcome to the program again. What are your insights about the 2020 election and the impact on real estate and valuation?
Hi, everyone. As Bill mentioned, I'm Brian Rodgers, Manager of Federal Affairs for the Appraisal Institute. I work with Bill Garber and Scott DiBiasio in the Washington, D.C. Office of Government Affairs. It's great to be back on AI Answers, talking to you from my house. This time I'll be discussing the recent election and the outlook for Congress and the incoming Biden administration moving forward. Well, as you know, Election Day turned into election week, or maybe even weeks, with President-elect Joe Biden exceeding the 270-vote Electoral College threshold and receiving more than 75 million votes nationwide. The Biden-Harris campaign is currently at around 279 electoral votes and is likely to possibly likely to win Arizona and Georgia by a small amount. This possibly netting as many as 306 electoral votes. He's set to be sworn in by January 20th. In the meantime, the president-elect has begun putting together a transition team and will likely begin naming some key White House officials soon, and cabinet members closer to Thanksgiving or possibly early December. As the initial focus of the administration is expected to be getting the coronavirus under control, some healthcare, and the state of the economy. I'll just be discussing this a little bit further a bit later. With about 16 races still not called yet, the current makeup of the House is about 218 Democrats and 201 Republicans. That's expected the House Democrats will remain in control of the chamber with a small majority after underperforming this election, which resulted in Republicans gaining a net of five or six seats so far, with that number expecting to climb. Republicans managed to erase some of the gains Democrats made in some of the suburbs in the 2018 election, including Arlington County, California. The Senate now. The Senate is current stands at 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats and independents. But now post-election, the Senate majority will come down to the two runoff elections in Georgia on January 5th, after both Republican incumbent Senator David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler did not meet the required 50% of the threshold. So 2 more months of political ads for Georgia residents there. The Senate race in Alaska has just become official this afternoon, and incumbent Republican Dan Sullivan has prevailed, bringing the total to 50 Republicans and 48 Democrats and independents. Democrats will need to flip both Georgia seats to take the majority via Vice President-elect Harris serving as a tiebreaker in a 50-50 Senate. So things will be interesting there. And this will put a lot of the pressure, a lot of focus on the moderate members of both parties.
Brian, before you go further on that, what do you think that's going to have any impact on appointments made by the Biden administration and thinking about the Georgia elections at all? Do they need to be cognizant of that as the runoff elections occur?
Yeah, well, we think there's a thought that it might be have a moderating effect. So maybe the progressive dreams of having perhaps Senator Warren or Senator Sanders as Labor Secretary may still happen, but may not be as obvious this time around. They may have to get somebody more seen as more of a moderate to get through the Senate. It's assumed that Joe Biden will take a different approach than Donald Trump has with getting people through, nominees through the Senate. They may not do as many acting nominees as President Trump has done. So, but there's been some debate, internal Democratic debate there on that. So, but it will probably have a moderating effect there for President-elect Biden.
Thank you.
So with the Biden win and the Republicans likely to hold on to a slim majority of the Senate, it's hard to imagine any substantial or even slightly controversial legislative measures getting through the finish line here. You know, in the lame duck, we expect Congress to not address too much outside of an agreement on government funding and a last attempt at another COVID relief bill. The COVID relief bill could be comprised of bipartisan standalone fiscal stimulus items like renewing the popular Paycheck Protection Program, and so it could be somewhere between 500 billion or maybe 1.5 trillion range. So, but however, it's unclear if President Trump will still sign another either size bill, you know, after losing re-election. The CARES Act included relief measures for some accounting-related provisions that relate to commercial real estate, troubled debt restructuring, and the current expected credit loss provisions in particular. Those appear to have bipartisan support, and we would be not surprised to see them extended in the relief package. Also, consideration of other end-of-year items such as tax standards, which are one of the few areas where there's some bipartisan consensus. Something that could be reached this year, depending on whether another COVID relief bill is passed or not. You know, it's unlikely Congress will now consider any housing items during the lame duck session, thus punting the following pending appraisal bills into the next session. We talked about HR 7688, which is the Portal for Appraisal Licensing Act. That's likely going to be punted until the next session. S4673, that's recently introduced eminent domain legislation that includes provision that requires all property to be appraised in accordance with uniform appraisal standards before an offer of just compensation is extended, as well as provision allowing a landowner representative to have the opportunity to accompany the appraiser during the inspection. But again, that's something we see popping up again. That's not going to go away. Conservation easement legislation. There's FHA appraisal bills that from early this past session that have not crossed the finish line. The AI Office of Government Affairs expects these bills to be reintroduced next session and could be considered in any housing package looked at by Congress. We'll definitely be keeping you updated as this happens. We also expect, as far as the appraisal flexibilities go, we also expect the FHA and the federal banking agencies to continue with the appraisal flexibilities instituted since COVID, especially as cases have been ramping up throughout the country. You know, we likely through the winter time at this point.
I think we saw that there was an attempt to include the syndicated conservation easement legislation in some of the final packages, at least pushed by some of the conservation organizations that we were supporting, along with groups like the Land Trust Alliance and the Nature Conservancy. But the prospect of that is very much in question, I would think. It's going to be a very tight package, tight timeline to get anything done.
Absolutely. So really the emphasis on bipartisan legislation, which that largely is, but that's so if something sneaks through, it could be something like that, the tax bill or tax, but there's no guarantee of that. But you know, looking ahead to the next maybe perhaps early next session, you know, for now, let's assume the Republicans hold on to the Senate. You know, Democrats will have fewer legislative tools to assist the Biden administration, as the chamber will serve as a firewall against many progressive leading campaign promises, and legislation comes out of the House. You know, the filibuster will be intact, and any legislation that the President-elect Biden would like to pass will require broad support from the Senate. Democrats and potentially 12 Republicans will be needed. So this means moderates from both parties will be important swing votes, and likely makes the sweeping legislative proposals from the Biden campaign more challenging. You know, what President-elect Biden's economic, as I sort of mentioned this already, economic appointees will also need Republican support to be confirmed if they control the Senate. It's likely to have a natural moderating effect on the elections. You know, though he'll likely be able, under pressure from progressive wing, to push the envelope of some positions, and will likely try. One spot we expect the president-elect to move quickly is at the CFPB. Removal of Director Kraninger could come probably as early as February. You know, so President-elect Biden will likely get his people in place as soon as he can. In addition to the COVID crisis in healthcare, Biden's expected to take a serious look at housing policy, and it'll look quite different from the approach President Trump has taken. You know, real estate experts expect the biggest difference to come in the form of renewed federal focus on racial equality and anti-discrimination regulation. The Biden campaign called for more education of appraisers on issues such as implicit bias, and the Appraisal Institute has accepted that challenge with programs already under development on those related topics. We've also been discussing how creative financing programs might also be brought into discussion. Programs that attempt to with financial support for differences between the project cost and the subject property's market value, or what some refer to as the appraisal gap. So there's definitely different approaches here that can be taken. And we can see legislative development to support programs like the Detroit Home Mortgage, which is tackling the appraisal gap with secondary sources of financing. So we expect these discussions to continue starting pretty soon and well into the Biden administration. The Appraisal Institute stands to be part of that conversation. Biden's also expected to push for a tax credit of up to $15,000, for first-time home buyers. It's reviving a tax credit for first-time buyers that was enacted during the Great Recession, but ended in 2010. That incentive aimed to spur demand during a housing crash. Now, there isn't a crash, but soaring home prices have made affordability a challenge for many would-be buyers, especially first-time home buyers.
Just an add-on to that fair housing issue too, we've seen commentary about the Biden plan to promote education in the appraisal community on implicit bias. And I think one of the responses that's likely there is for that education to be built into the existing USPAP education, particularly the 7-hour update. That seems to be where the Appraisal Foundation is moving at this point, to include some components or modules relating to bias or fair housing within the USPAP requirements, which is an existing requirement for appraisers. So technically there may not be a new education requirement imposed, although the AQB could continue to look at that issue, and they may consider an additional CE requirement around fair housing or bias issues, but they will almost certainly build this into the pre-existing USPAP education requirement, and particularly the 7-hour update for those that have interest in that.
Absolutely. And so that takes us to the end of the federal election update. And Scott DiBiasio joined us for the state general election summary.
Before we move to that, and I'll just go ahead and transition our slides here, Brian, what's one of the big things that's been on the table in recent years is the conservatorship of the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And there's been a push by the Federal Housing Finance Agency to try to take those GSEs out of conservatorship. And seemingly this election and the result might put some brakes on that, this in theory and on paper. And traditionally, the Obama administration, prior administration, had used the GSEs as a policy tool for various issues like affordable housing or rural housing or in duty to serve, underserved market type activity. Do you have any thoughts on that? What might happen with GSE reform at this point?
It'll be interesting to see. Again, assume the Republicans keep the Senate. And it's been 5 or 6 years now. There was a pretty decent push with the bipartisan senators working towards GSE reform, and it turns out that didn't really come very close either. That felt closer than it probably was, but I assume there'll be more emphasis there. And there was talk about the FHFA director Calabria, his stance there too, his status under the Biden administration. I would think he would be somebody they would look to replace as well, but they may keep him in place because there's some shared. Director Calabria is fairly conservative compared to Joe Biden, especially, but they may keep him in place actually as long as they can, what I've understood. But I assume there'll be some renewed interest there, and the Senate Banking Committee Chair Toomey, incoming likely, will, I think, renew that discussion again. But with Donald Trump, President Trump, sort of not directing things, I think there might be a slightly different approach.
Yep, thanks for that. We'll keep an eye on it. And let's go ahead and shift gears, look at some of the state issues. Scott, I know you've been busy tracking some of the recent election results at the state level and, of course, related to our overall state advocacy programs. What are your insights from last week?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. What I want to do here over the next couple of minutes is just sort of go up to the 30,000-foot level and take a look at some of the state general election results, and in particular, the governor's races, the state legislatures, and some ballot initiatives that were on the ballot in a couple of different states that will and do have impacts on real estate. We're not going to go into the specifics of any state's individual election or the results. One thing that I did want to say at the outset here is that one theme that I think you're going to see over the next couple of minutes here is that the expected Democrat blue wave that didn't materialize at the federal level also didn't materialize at the state level. And in some respects, I think you can say that with the statewide elections and even further down the ballot into some of the local and municipal elections, I think a good case could be made that there was actually a little bit of a red ripple rather than a blue wave. So keep that in mind here as we go through the next couple of minutes of looking at the governor's races and state legislatures. Before we can do that, I think it is important to set the scene for where we are right now and where we were prior to last Tuesday. This is the lay of the land that will be in place until the new governors and legislatures come in January. Currently, there are 26 Republican governors, 24 Democrat governors, and there were only 11 governor's races on the ballot here in 2020. Most states have what they call off-year governor elections, so we'll see a big a large number of governor's races in 2022. So there were only 11 on the ballot this time around, and Democrats were charged with defending 4 of those seats in Delaware, Montana, North Carolina, and Washington State. And the Republicans were charged with defending 7 of those governor seats. There were 2 open seats this time. The current governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, was term limited out, and he actually ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate. And the governor of Utah decided not to seek re-election. So that was also an open seat. So after the election of last week, there really hasn't been that much of a change. Only one governorship switched, and again, that was in Montana, where current Congressman Greg Gianforte won the seat being vacated by the aforementioned Steve Bullock. The other 10 governorships stayed with the party that currently holds the seat, including in Utah. And interestingly enough, all of the incumbents that ran were successfully reelected. Switching gears now just slightly, looking at the state legislatures and what we can expect to see when they begin coming back into session in early January. There are 7,383 state legislators around the country. 52 of those are 52% of those are Republicans, 47% are Democrat, and 1% are members of third parties or are independents. There are 99 legislative chambers around the country, and the reason for the odd number is that Nebraska has a unicameral legislature, a single body. And of those 99 chambers, 60 are controlled by the Republicans, and 39 are currently controlled by the Democrats. And another interesting phenomenon to look at is state legislative control, and that is where one party controls both the upper and the lower chamber of a state's legislature. And there are 30 states where the legislatures are fully controlled by the Republicans. There are 19 states that are fully controlled by the Democrats, and one state, Minnesota, is split, where the Senate's, the Republicans there control the Senate, and the DFL, Democrat Farmer Laborers, control the House of Representatives. Another interesting thing is to look at state control, and this is where a single party controls both houses of the legislature, as well as the governor's office. And there are currently 22 states that have what we refer to as the trifecta. There are 15 states that have Democrat trifectas, and there are 13 states with divided government, and that is where the governor is of a different party than the state legislature. One thing that's kind of interesting here, and I wanted to mention about divided government is that, you see in a lot of places where the American people are really satisfied with divided government. And I'll point specifically to Vermont, just as an example. Vermont has probably two of the most liberal U.S. senators in Bernie Sanders and Patrick Leahy, but they also just re-elected a very conservative Republican governor. So there is sort of a dichotomy there that they feel comfortable electing very liberal federal representatives, but at the state level, they like keeping Republican control. And in some states, the opposite is true. Here in Maryland, where I live and where I'm coming to you from right now, we have an overwhelmingly democratically controlled state legislature and a very, very popular Republican governor. And there are many other states that are in a similar type of situation.
Well, Scott, let me jump in real quick. Are we going through a process of redistricting in the next session?
Yes, that is something that I'm going to get to here in just a couple of minutes. But now that the 2020 census is complete, all of the state legislatures, and in some cases they have bipartisan redistricting commissions, but that process will take place throughout 2011 so that the new districts are in place for the 2022 elections. And that'll, that process will be unfolding here over the next couple of months. And I think you can see here, what the likely result is to be with the Republicans controlling most of the state legislative chambers, and in some cases even having the trifecta. The Republicans do have an upper hand of sorts as it relates to redistricting for both federal offices as well as for state and in some cases local races as well. Now, like I mentioned, there are, I think, many states that have sort of a bipartisan process that is utilized for redistricting so that one party or the other doesn't have a significant advantage, like what would probably occur if it was only the state legislatures that were making these redistricting decisions.
Thank you.
So in 2020, last Tuesday, there were 86 of the 99 chambers and 44 states that held state legislative elections. And according to Ballotpedia, they had identified 24 of those as being battleground chambers. In other words, where it was likely or possible that the party that was currently or that is currently in control would be overtaken by the opposite party and assume control of those chambers. Democrats held 8 of those battleground chambers, and 15 of them are currently held by Republicans. And a very interesting thing in Alaska, in the House, there's what is referred to as a power sharing agreement. The Republicans control that House, I believe, by a 22 to 15 margin, but the leadership and committee assignments are split between the Republicans and the Democrats. It's kind of an interesting situation, but the Alaska House was identified as a battleground chamber, meaning that the Republicans were looking to take back full control of the House, or it may have even been possible that the Democrats would have been able to overcome that 7-seat deficit and perhaps become the majority party in the Alaska House of Representatives. A couple of other battleground states, most of them in historically fairly red states. Both the Arizona House and Senate and the Florida Senate were identified. The Pennsylvania House and Senate, and very interestingly enough, the Texas House of Representatives was identified as a battleground chamber, which is interesting in that Texas has historically been a fairly red state, but over the last couple of years, due to in-migration from more liberal states such as California, Texas has become very much a purple state now, and there was some concern and some talk that the Texas House of Representatives could potentially fall and be overtaken by the Democrats for the first time in really quite a long time. So where do we stand after last Tuesday, and what were the results? Most of the battleground situations that were identified really didn't turn into the fights that the prognosticators thought that they were going to be. Only two of the chambers that were identified as battleground chambers, both in the same state in New Hampshire, flipped into control from the other party. Democrats had a really solid handle on both the New Hampshire House and the Senate. The Republicans now picked up both of those chambers really by a very significant margin. I think in the New Hampshire House, which is particularly large, I think there's 300 and some odd members of the New Hampshire House. The Republicans actually picked up somewhere around 75 seats in the House, and the margins flipped right on their head. While I want to say that the Democrats previously controlled the House by, let's say, a 2-to-1 margin, now the Republicans control that House by a 2-to-1 margin. And a similar situation happened in the New Hampshire Senate. New Hampshire is one of the states now that has the trifecta, Republican governor, as well as lower and upper chambers that are controlled by the Republicans as well. And the Republicans, it is likely that the Republicans will claim full control of the Alaska House, and that power sharing agreement that I talked about a couple of minutes ago will no longer be in place. Still a lot of undecided seats in Arizona, but it looks like those seats most of them will stay Republican, and the Arizona House will stay in Republican hands as well. A couple of other battleground chambers here, and as you can see, not a whole lot changed. The Republicans likely picked up just one seat in Florida, so they expanded their majority by one seat in the Florida Senate. North Carolina, both the House and Senate there stayed pretty much with the same number of Republicans and remained in Republican hands. And there's still a bunch of undecided races in Pennsylvania in both their House and the Senate. But it looks like the Democrats picked up a few seats, but not enough to flip those chambers such that they will be controlled by the Democrats in January. And mentioning again about the Texas House, the Republicans did lose a few seats, but they were successful in keeping that chamber. And of course, the Democrats had been projected to take the Texas House for the first time in, again, quite a long time. So that's another, part of the blue wave that didn't actually materialize. So what are the next sessions of the state legislatures going to look like? And again, not much really has changed. Of the 99 chambers, 62 will be Republican, 37 will be Democrat, and that is the pickup of accounting for the pickup of the two houses in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire, again, was the one state that flipped both the upper and lower chambers of their legislature into Republican control, such that 31 states now are fully controlled by the Republicans, the state legislatures, that is. There are 18 states that are fully controlled by the Democrats, and again, that one state, Minnesota, that is split. Nothing changed there. And full state control, there were two pickups there. Again, New Hampshire and Congressman Gianforte being elected to the governorship of Montana, put that state fully in the control of the Republicans. So now there's 24 fully controlled Republican states, 13 that are fully controlled by the Democrats, and 13 that are still divided. Did want to bring your attention just real quick to a number, looks like about 10 or so appraisers that serve as state legislators that were reelected to their seats. And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. There may be some other state legislators that also have appraisal backgrounds and are engaged in the appraisal business. But these are the ones that we have been able to identify. They list real estate appraisal as their profession within their biography. And in many cases, we've had established very good relationships with them and have worked with them on various pieces of legislation. For instance, Greg Rothman, Representative Greg Rothman in Pennsylvania, he's an MAI, and we worked very closely with him on some BPO related legislation a couple of years ago. Senator Bill Weber is actually a rural appraiser, but also obviously very interested in appraisal related issues, and has become a good friend of the profession in Minnesota. Just wanted to share a couple of headlines that I was able to pull out from the media just in the last couple of days. From the Atlantic, Democrats' 2020 losses in states will haunt the party. And I think that goes back to Bill's first question about redistricting. And the next one from the Hill is in relation to stability. Again, we didn't see a lot of chambers that switched parties. And I think I read something that this was the least number of chambers that had flipped since something like 1946. So there really is just an unprecedented amount of stability right now. And from New York Magazine, 2020 was a disaster for Democrats trying to take over state houses. And again, to the redistricting question, these state legislative elections are going to be key to the redistricting power. Wanted to switch gears just slightly here and talk about some real estate related ballot measures that were up for consideration last Tuesday. In total, there were 129 statewide ballot measures in 44 states. Obviously, not all of those were real estate related, but there were, I believe, like 6 or 7 that were very closely of interest to real estate professionals. So we'll go through and talk a little bit about very quickly what each of those ballot measures will do, or in some cases would have done since they were defeated. Of course, there was Proposition 15 in California. This proposition would have amended the state constitution to require commercial and industrial properties, except those zoned as commercial agriculture, to be taxed based on their market value. It's a very interesting situation in California where they had Proposition 13 that was passed back in 1978, and that proposition amended the state constitution to require that residential, commercial, and industrial properties be taxed based on their purchase price. And the tax increase in the tax assessment is limited to no more than 1% of the purchase price, and is limited to an annual adjustment equal to the rate of inflation or 2%, whichever is lower. So Proposition 15 was intended to try to change the way that taxes are assessed in California, and this proposition failed by 4 percentage points, 52% to 48. There was also another real estate related proposition on the ballot in California, the local rent control initiative. This measure would have amended state law to allow local governments to establish rent control on residential properties that are over 15 years old. It would have allowed local limits on annual rent increases to differ from the current statewide limit. This measure would have also allowed rent increases in rent-controlled properties of up to 15% over 3 years at the start of a new tenancy, and that is above any increase allowed by local ordinance. And it would have prohibited rent control importantly, from violating landlords' right to earn a fair financial return. This measure also failed by 60% to 40%. So as it relates to real estate ballot measures in California, the two that were on the ballot, neither one of them was successful. Switching to Colorado, they had Amendment B, and this is intended and will repeal what is referred to as the Gallagher Amendment. And that amendment several years ago set residential and non-residential property tax assessment rates in the Constitution, the state Constitution. So Amendment B will allow the Colorado State Legislature to freeze property tax assessment rates at the current rates, 7.15% for residential property and 29% for non-residential property. This initiative also will allow the state legislature to provide for future property tax assessment decreases through state law. And interestingly enough, future tax assessment rate increases will still need to be approved by the voters. A couple of more here. We'll move through them very quickly. Florida Amendment 5 is a pretty simple one. This amendment extends the period during which a person, homeowner, property owner, may transfer certain property tax savings benefits, known as Save Our Homes benefits, to a new homestead property and extends that period when they can do that from 2 years to 3 years. This measure passed by a vote of 75% to 25%. And in Louisiana, there were two ballot initiatives there. Amendment 5, which failed, would have authorized an exemption from ad valorem property taxes for certain property when the owner of the property entered into what is referred to as a cooperative endeavor agreement with a taxing authority. And those agreements generally are that the property owner will make payments to the taxing authority, direct payments to the taxing authority in lieu of real estate property taxes. And Louisiana Amendment 6, another fairly simple one, increased the income threshold to qualify for the special assessment level for residential property receiving a homestead exemption. And increased that income limit from $50,000 to $100,000 per year, beginning in 2026. And all of those increases are tied back to the Consumer Price Index. For instance, the income limit in 2020 for special assessment applications was just over $77,000. That initiative, not surprisingly, passed by a overwhelming, not overwhelming, 2-to-1, I guess is probably the best way to put it, 62% to 38%. And lastly, in Nebraska, there was amendment number 2, which increased the repayment period for tax increment financing from 15 years to 20 years for areas where more than 1/2 of the properties are designated as extremely blighted. In that state, an extremely blighted area is defined as a census tract with an average unemployment rate that is 200% or more of the average state unemployment rate, and the poverty rate is more than 20%. So just giving those property owners that had developed their properties using tax increment financing a little bit more time to pay those funds to the local government, or in some cases, I think it could be the state government too. And of course, that measure did pass as well, 61% to 39%. So with that, I have come to the end of what I wanted to share with you all as it relates to the state elections that took place last week. And of course, we will be continuing to monitor for developments at the state legislative level. And of course, within also state appraiser regulatory agencies. But that is where the governor's seats and the state legislatures will stand going into into January. So I appreciate the opportunity to be back on AI Answers again, and I will turn it back over to Bill. Thanks.
Yep, thanks, Scott. Let me ask you real quick. So what are your thoughts about where we are with COVID right now? I know you've been starting to see some of the lockdown rollback measures come back into play. Is that coming into focus at this point, or is it any clarity there or any opinions on that?
Absolutely. As you'll recall, back at the beginning of the pandemic, we did, I think we did a pretty good job of tracking all of the various stay-at-home orders, shelter-in-place orders, and various restrictions that were imposed, including some that were imposed on appraisers. And unfortunately, I think we're at the point now where a lot of state and local governments are once again in the position of having to reconsider imposing once again restrictions on various activities. I don't think that those restrictions are going to be as onerous as they were back in March, April, May timeframe, but certainly there are going to be efforts to put new restrictions and further restrictions in place. And just yesterday here in Maryland, where I live, the governor did announce that he was reimposing some restrictions on bars and restaurants, which have been identified as being super spreader places. I guess they have a lot of statistics that show that people gathering in bars and restaurants have a high propensity to spread the virus. So yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that we're going to have to be very vigilant for hearing moving forward, and hopefully appraisers will fare as well as they did back during the original imposition of the restrictions. And we only had to deal with situations in 2 or 3 states where appraisers really were not able to continue practicing during the time of the restrictions. Again, I don't think the restrictions are going to be as restrictive and onerous as they were back earlier this year, but we're definitely going to have to put that back on our radar screen and monitor for it.
Last question relating to the budget process. The COVID environment has negatively affected state budgets, and a lot of the measures that you were speaking to turned away some of those measures that would have provided a level of relief or some additional revenue. What's your prediction as to what's going to happen relative to budget debates at the state level next year?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that. The split roll ballot initiative in California, Proposition 15, was estimated to raise, I think, something like $11 billion additional dollars that would have been earmarked specifically for education, or a significant portion of the funds would have been earmarked for education. Now that the legislature there is going to have to take a look and see if in fact they want to try to find $11 billion to earmark for education. And unfortunately, I don't think they're going to be able to find that money absent some other form of significant tax increase. In California, they have, and I believe that it expired within the last couple of years, but they had the millionaires tax. I know, in speaking with some folks out there, that that is something that they may be looking at again in the very near future. But yeah, it's going to be a very tough budget year for the states. Of course, sales tax revenue is down, liquor taxes are down significantly, all of those things. So it's going to be I know a lot of states have, including some appraiser regulatory agencies, are looking at furloughs and layoffs to be able to save some funds just within their own regulatory agencies. And unfortunately, I think we're going to see that extend far beyond that at all levels of government.
Thank you for that. Guys, thanks for all of the work that you do and for your insights here today. Look forward to talking to you again soon on AI Answers. And to our listeners, we'll see you again next week. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks for having us.